The letter arrived at dawn, and by the time Eleanor Whitfield finished reading it, her hands were shaking so badly she had to set it down on the kitchen table. Her father owed money to men who did not forgive debts, men who had already sent someone to stand outside their door the night before, saying nothing, simply watching. Now there was a solution on paper, and it had a name attached to it. Lord Edmund Hale wished to marry her within the week. She had met him only once, at a dinner 3 years earlier, and he had barely spoken 10 words to her. Now he was offering to clear every debt her family owed, in exchange for a wedding ring, and her silence about the arrangement being anything other than love. Her mother wept with relief. Her father would not look her in the eye. Eleanor stood in the hallway of their crumbling townhouse and asked herself why a man with his fortune, his title, his choice of any bride in the county, would want her. She had no great beauty that turned heads, no fortune of her own, nothing that explained the size of the offer. There was only one answer that made sense. He needed something more than a wife. He needed a reason for people to stop asking questions about him. She said yes anyway, because there was no other door open to her family, and because curiosity had already taken root where fear should have been. The carriage that came for her 3 days later was black and unmarked, without the Hale crest on its doors, which she found strange for a man so proud of his name in every other way. Inside, Edmund Hale sat with his hat in his lap and his eyes fixed on the window, as though he could not quite look at her yet. He was younger than she remembered, and colder, not cruel, she would learn later, but guarded in a way that made every word he spoke feel measured before it left his mouth. "You understand the terms," he said, without greeting her first. "I understand there are terms I have not yet been told," she answered. That earned her the first real look he had given her, sharp and assessing, as though he were recalculating something about her. "You will be my wife in every way that matters to the public," he said. "You will live in my house, wear my name, and want for nothing. In return, you will not ask questions about matters that do not concern you. Everything concerns a wife, my lord, if she is to live in the same house." He did not answer that. The carriage rolled on toward his estate in silence, and Eleanor watched the fields blur past the window, wondering what kind of man needed a wife the way other men needed an alibi. The wedding took place 2 days later in a small chapel with almost no guests, only his sister Charlotte, pale and nervous, and a handful of servants standing at the back like witnesses to something they did not fully understand either. There was no wedding breakfast, no celebration. Vows were spoken, papers were signed, and within an hour, Eleanor found herself installed in a house larger than any she had ever lived in, married to a man who had not touched her hand once since the ceremony ended. Hale House stood at the edge of a forest, 3 hours from London by good road, isolated enough that visitors rarely came without warning. The staff were polite but watchful, the way people are watchful when they have been told to be careful around a particular subject. Eleanor noticed it within her first evening, the way a young footman glanced at his master's study door and then quickly away, as though the room itself were something to be avoided. She was given a bedroom on the east wing, far from her husband's own quarters, connected by a corridor, she was told, gently but firmly, not to use after dark. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Fenwick, delivered this information as though it were the most ordinary rule in the world, and Eleanor filed it away as anything but ordinary. Dinner that first night was a strange, formal affair. Edmund spoke little, answering her questions about the house and the grounds with short, correct sentences that gave away nothing of himself. When she asked about his family, his expression closed like a door shutting. "My parents are gone," he said. "My sister lives with us. That is all there is to know." "That cannot be all," Eleanor said, and immediately regretted the boldness in her own voice. He set down his fork. "You agreed to ask no questions." "I agreed to marry a stranger to save my family. I did not agree to live blind in his house." For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked almost like respect, though it vanished as quickly as it came. He rose from the table without finishing his meal and left her sitting alone in the candlelight, the silence of the great house pressing in around her like water. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor rose and walked the unfamiliar corridors of her new home. She told herself she was simply exploring, learning the layout of the place she would now call home, but her feet carried her toward the forbidden east corridor almost without her permission. She heard voices before she reached the end of it, low, urgent, coming from behind a door that had been left slightly open. She recognized Edmund's voice first, tight with something close to anger. The second voice belonged to a man she did not know, older, rougher in his speech, the kind of voice that did not belong in a gentleman's house. "You cannot keep paying me forever," the stranger said. Eventually someone will ask where the money goes. That is why I married, Edmund said. A wife gives me a reason for expenses no one questions. Household costs, new furnishings. No one looks twice at a man spending on his bride. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had not imagined that her marriage itself might be part of whatever secret he was hiding, a piece of a larger puzzle designed to disguise something dark enough that a man would pay to keep it buried. And if she finds out? The stranger asked. She will not, Edmund said, his voice hard as stone. She knows better than to ask questions that are not hers to ask. Eleanor stepped back from the door so quickly she nearly knocked over a small table in the corridor. She caught it just in time, her heart hammering, and hurried back toward her own room before either voice could notice she had ever been there. She lay awake for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, turning the conversation over in her mind. He was paying someone, secretly, and she, apparently, was part of the cover for it. In the morning, she dressed carefully and went down to breakfast, determined to say nothing of what she had heard, not yet. If her husband believed she would remain a blind, obedient wife who never wondered about locked doors and midnight visitors, she intended to let him believe it a little longer. It was easier to learn the truth from the shadows than to demand it from a man who had already shown her exactly how far he would go to protect it. Edmund was already seated when she arrived, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him, dark circles beneath his eyes that had not been there the day before. He glanced up as she entered, and something in his expression shifted, guarded but almost searching, as though he were trying to read whether she had heard anything in the night. "You look tired, my lord," she said carefully, taking her seat. "I did not sleep well," he admitted. "The house takes some getting used to." "I imagine it does," Eleanor said, holding his gaze a moment longer than necessary. "There is a great deal here I do not yet understand." He did not answer, but she saw his hand tighten slightly around his cup, and she knew, with a certainty that settled cold and clear in her chest, that whatever secret he was protecting, she had just placed herself directly inside its path. Later that morning, Charlotte found her walking alone in the garden, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the cool air. Edmund's sister was younger than Eleanor had expected, no more than 19, with the same guarded eyes as her brother, though hers held more warmth beneath the caution. "You must think us a strange family," Charlotte said, falling into step beside her. "I think your brother is a man with a great many secrets," Eleanor said honestly. She had decided already that pretending ignorance with Charlotte would gain her nothing. Charlotte's steps faltered slightly. "He does what he must to protect this house. To protect me. Protect you from what? That is not mine to tell." Charlotte's voice was gentle but firm, closing the subject as cleanly as her brother had closed it the night before. "I will only say this. Whatever you think of him, he is not a cruel man. He is a frightened one. And frightened men make strange choices." The word frightened surprised Eleanor. She had expected arrogance from a man who could purchase a wife the way other men purchased horses, not fear. She studied Charlotte's face for a long moment, searching for any further clue, but the younger woman had already turned the conversation toward the roses lining the garden path, and Eleanor understood the door had been shut again, as firmly as every other door in this house. That afternoon, she explored the grounds alone, walking the long gravel path that led toward the edge of the forest bordering the estate. She found an old groundskeeper trimming hedges near the boundary wall, an elderly man named Samuel who had worked for the Hale family for over 30 years. He seemed less guarded than the rest of the household, perhaps because age had worn away his patience for careful silence. "You're the new mistress," he said, not unkindly, when she greeted him. "I am. Eleanor Hale, though the name still feels borrowed." Samuel chuckled at that, a low, dry sound. "Takes time, that. This house has swallowed stranger things than a new name." "What do you mean by that?" His smile faded slightly, and he returned his attention to the hedge, clipping with more focus than the task required. "Not my place to say, my lady. Ask his lordship, if you've the courage for it. Though I doubt you'll get further than the rest of us have." Eleanor left him to his work, but his words stayed with her through the rest of the day, a small confirmation that she was not imagining the strangeness of the house, that others had tried and failed to learn whatever truth lived behind Edmund's careful silence. By evening, she had resolved to be patient rather than reckless. A man who paid strangers in the dead of night to keep something buried would not be pressed into confession by a wife of 2 days. She would need to watch, to listen, to gather the fragments scattered around her until they formed a shape she could understand. She thought again of the voice in the corridor, the words that had chilled her more with every hour that passed. "A wife gives me a reason for expenses no one questions." She was not simply a bride. She was a piece of armor. purchased and fitted to hide something Edmund Hale could not afford the world to see. And though the thought frightened her, it also steadied something inside her that had been trembling since the letter arrived at her family's door. If she was already inside the danger, whether she wished it or not, then she intended to understand exactly what kind of danger it was. That night, she did not sleep in the east wing bedroom she had been given. Instead, she sat by her window long after the candles had burned low, watching the dark tree line beyond the garden wall, waiting to see if the stranger from the corridor would return. No one came. But somewhere in the house below, she heard footsteps pacing, slow and restless, back and forth across a floor that never quite went silent until the earliest hours of the morning. She rose the next day more determined than afraid, dressing carefully, composing her face into something calm and unreadable to match her husband's own guarded expression. Whatever Edmund Hale was hiding, she intended to become someone he could not simply dismiss, manage, or keep in the dark. She had married a stranger to save her family. She would not spend the rest of her life a stranger inside her own home. A scream tore through Hale House just before midnight, sharp enough to bring Eleanor bolt upright in her bed, her heart slamming against her ribs before she was even fully awake. It came from somewhere below, followed by the sound of glass breaking and a man's voice shouting words she could not make out. She grabbed her robe and ran into the corridor without thinking, nearly colliding with Mrs. Fenwick, who was hurrying the opposite direction with a candle shaking in her hand. "Go back to your room, my lady," the housekeeper said, breathless. "Please. This does not concern you." "Someone is screaming in my own house. It concerns me a great deal." Eleanor pushed past her before the older woman could stop her and followed the sound down the main staircase toward the study, the room she had been warned away from since her very first night. The door stood open now, light spilling out into the hallway, and inside she found Edmund kneeling on the floor beside an overturned chair, blood staining the sleeve of his shirt, a broken decanter scattered in pieces around him. A second man stood near the window, the same rough-voiced stranger she had heard in the corridor days before, his face twisted with anger, a knife still in his hand. "Edmund," Eleanor said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Both men turned toward her at once. The stranger's eyes moved from her face to Edmund's, calculating something dangerous, before he lowered the knife and backed toward the open window. "This isn't finished," the man said, and then he was gone, disappearing into the dark garden beyond the glass. Eleanor rushed to Edmund's side, pressing her hands against the wound on his arm before she had even decided to do it. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. "You should not have come down here," he said through gritted teeth. "You should not be bleeding on your study floor," she answered. "Hold still." She tore a strip of cloth from her own robe and bound the wound as best she could, her hands moving with a steadiness that surprised even her. When it was done, she helped him into a chair and finally allowed herself to look at him properly, at the exhaustion carved into his face, the fear he could no longer fully hide. "Who was that man?" she said. It was not a question anymore. It was a demand, quiet but unmovable. For a long moment, Edmund said nothing. Then, perhaps because the pain had worn down his usual careful walls, or perhaps because he had simply run out of ways to keep her at a distance, he began to speak. "His name is Gerald Finch," he said. "He worked for my father many years ago, managing certain matters my father did not wish handled through proper channels. When my father died, those matters became mine, and so did the debt owed to keep them quiet." "What matters?" Eleanor pressed. Edmund's jaw tightened. "Not tonight. I cannot tell you all of it tonight. You nearly died tonight, which is precisely why I cannot burden you with more than you already carry," he said, and there was something almost gentle beneath the sharpness of his tone, an attempt at protection rather than dismissal, though it did little to soften her frustration. She wanted to press further, but the sight of him, pale and wounded, stopped her. Instead, she helped him to his room, refusing his protests that he could manage alone, and sat with him until a physician arrived from the nearby village to properly dress the wound. Only when the doctor had gone and the house had settled back into an uneasy quiet did she finally return to her own bed, though sleep did not come easily. The following days brought a subtle shift between them. Edmund, weakened by his injury and perhaps by the effort of maintaining walls that had nearly gotten him killed, allowed her closer than he had before. He took his meals with her rather than in solitary silence. He asked her opinion on small matters of the household, listened when she answered, and once, when she made an observation about the estate's finances that surprised him with its sharpness, he looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has badly underestimated. "You have a mind for numbers," he said one evening, looking over the household ledgers she had begun helping him organize. I managed my father's accounts for years before his debts grew too large to manage at all, she said. It is one skill this marriage has finally made useful. He almost smiled at that, a small, unfamiliar expression that changed his whole face for a moment, before caution returned to smooth it away again. Charlotte noticed the shift too, and one afternoon, while the two women sat together in the drawing room, she offered Eleanor a piece of information her brother had not. Gerald Finch is not merely a debt collector, Charlotte said quietly, glancing toward the closed door as though the walls themselves might be listening. He knows something about our father, something that, if it became known, would destroy what remains of our family's name, and perhaps far worse than our name. Worse how? Charlotte hesitated, twisting her hands together in her lap. There are papers, old papers, from before I was born, that prove our father did something no one is meant to know. Edmund has spent years paying Finch to keep them hidden, but the money is running out, and Finch grows bolder every year. Why does your brother not simply confront him, expose him before he can be believed? Because the truth would destroy Edmund as surely as the lie would, Charlotte said. There is no version of this where the papers surface and my brother remains untouched. That is why he needed a marriage that looked ordinary enough to explain the money leaving this house every quarter. That is why he needed you. The words landed heavier than Eleanor expected, though she found, to her own surprise, that they no longer frightened her the way they once had. She understood now that she had not married a villain, but a man cornered by circumstances inherited rather than chosen, doing whatever he could to protect the people around him, even at the cost of his own peace. That evening, she found Edmund alone in the study, staring at the repaired window where Finch had escaped days before. She did not ask more questions. Instead, she sat across from him in silence, offering simply her presence, and after a long moment, he spoke without being asked. I did not want to marry you to use you, he said quietly. I want you to know that. I chose you because you seemed like someone strong enough to survive what living in this house might ask of you. I did not expect to be right so quickly, or so violently. I am not so easily broken, my lord, she said. No, he agreed, studying her with something new in his eyes, something that looked almost like gratitude. I am beginning to see that. The days that followed brought no further attacks, but the quiet felt fragile, a held breath rather than true peace. Eleanor spent her mornings walking the grounds, learning every path and doorway of the estate as though preparing for a battle she could not yet see the shape of. She spoke with Samuel again, who told her, carefully, that Finch had once worked the northern boundary of the property, and likely still knew every hidden entrance better than the family did. She began keeping a small notebook of her own, recording names, dates, anything Charlotte or the servants let slip in unguarded moments, piecing together a picture of the secret her husband was so desperate to protect. She did not yet know the full truth of what their father had done, but she understood enough to know it was dangerous, old, and buried deep enough that unearthing it might cost more than any of them could afford to pay. One night, unable to sleep, she rose and walked toward Edmund's room, drawn by a restlessness she did not fully understand. She found his door slightly open, and through the gap she saw him standing at his window, staring out at the dark garden, a folded letter clutched in his hand. Edmund, she said softly, and he turned, startled, quickly tucking the letter into his coat before she could see its contents. You should be asleep, he said. So should you. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he crossed the room and took her hand, an act so unexpected that she nearly pulled away out of surprise rather than reluctance. Thank you, he said simply, for staying, when you had every reason to run the moment you learned what kind of house you had married into. I do not run from storms, my lord, she said. I learned to stand inside them. He studied her face for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, before he finally released her hand and stepped back, though the distance between them no longer felt quite as vast as it had on their wedding day. The following morning, Eleanor woke early and made her way to the village on the pretense of visiting the local dressmaker, though her true purpose lay elsewhere. She had learned from Samuel that the village innkeeper, a woman named Margaret Call, had lived in the area longer than almost anyone, and might remember something of the elder Hale family before scandal ever touched their name. The inn was warm and smelled of fresh bread when Eleanor arrived, and Margaret greeted her with the polite curiosity most villagers reserved for the new mistress of Hale House. Over tea, Eleanor steered the conversation carefully, asking about the estate's history, the old groundskeepers, the family that had lived there before Edmund inherited it. The old lord was a hard man, Margaret said eventually, lowering her voice though the inn was nearly empty. Kept to himself, mostly, except for his dealings with a rough sort of man who used to come round late at night. Gerald Finch, if I recall the name right. Folk used to whisper that the old lord owed him more than money. What do you mean by that? Margaret hesitated, glancing toward the door as though the past itself might walk through it. There was a fire once, years back, at a warehouse near the coast. Belonged to a rival family, the kind of blaze that ruins a man's business overnight. No one was ever charged, but the whispers always circled back to the old lord, and the debts he was trying to escape at the time. Whether it's true, I couldn't say. But Finch was seen near that warehouse the same week it burned. Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral, though her mind raced ahead, connecting the fragments Margaret had given her to the fear she had seen in Edmund's eyes each time Finch's name was spoken. If the old lord had paid Finch to destroy a rival's fortune through fire, and people had been harmed or ruined in the process, then the papers Charlotte had mentioned were not simply an old embarrassment. They were proof of a crime severe enough to end the Hale family entirely, and perhaps to end Edmund's freedom along with it. She thanked Margaret for the tea and rode back to Hale House with the weight of the new information pressing heavily on her chest. She did not yet know how to raise the subject with Edmund without revealing how far she had already gone digging into his family's past, so she said nothing that evening, choosing instead to watch him more closely, searching his face for confirmation of what she now suspected. That night, after supper, Charlotte found her in the library, staring at a shelf of old estate records without truly reading them. "You look troubled," Charlotte said, settling into the chair across from her. "I visited the village today," Eleanor admitted. "I heard a story about a fire and a warehouse, and your father's dealings with Gerald Finch." Charlotte's face went pale, and for a moment, Eleanor feared she had pushed too far, too quickly. But instead of retreating into silence, Charlotte let out a long, shaking breath, as though relieved that someone else finally carried a piece of the burden she had held alone for years. "I was very young when it happened," Charlotte said quietly. "I do not remember the fire itself, only the way our father changed afterward. He grew careful, secretive, always looking over his shoulder. Edmund was older, old enough to understand more than I did, and I think that understanding has haunted him every day since our father died and left the whole burden in his hands." "Does Edmund believe their father was guilty?" "He has never said so plainly," Charlotte said, "but he pays Finch as though guilt were already proven, and that tells me more than any words he has never spoken aloud." Eleanor absorbed this in silence, turning the new understanding over in her mind. A crime from a previous generation, buried under years of secrecy and silver, now threatening to surface and destroy a man who had inherited both the guilt and the danger, without ever choosing either for himself. She thought of Edmund's exhaustion, the restless pacing she heard through the walls at night, the wound on his arm still healing beneath his sleeve, and something inside her softened further toward the man she had married, for reasons that had nothing to do with affection, and everything to do with survival. She resolved, that night, to stop simply gathering information from the shadows, and to bring what she had learned directly to Edmund himself, whatever the cost to the fragile trust they had only just begun building between them. Secrets, she was learning, grew heavier the longer they were carried alone, and she did not intend to let her husband carry this one by himself for much longer, whether he wished for her help or not. The study door burst open before Eleanor could knock, and Edmund's face, when he saw her standing there with a bundle of old papers clutched in her hands, drained of all color. "Where did you find those?" he said, his voice low and dangerous in a way she had not heard from him before. "In the locked drawer of your father's old desk in the East Wing," she said steadily, refusing to be intimidated by the sudden coldness in his eyes. "The one Mrs. Fenwick warned me never to open." "Then you understand why it was locked. I understand that a man died in a warehouse fire 11 years ago, and that your father paid Gerald Finch to make sure the true cause of that fire was never investigated," Eleanor said, laying the papers on the desk between them. "I understand that you have spent every year since inheriting this house paying to keep a man's death buried." Edmund sank into his chair as though his legs could no longer hold him, staring at the papers rather than at her. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire and his own unsteady breathing. "His name was Peter Grant," Edmund said finally, so quietly she had to lean forward to hear him. "He was a night watchman at the warehouse. My father owed money to the family who owned it, and rather than admit failure, he chose to erase the debt by erasing the building itself. Finch handled the fire. No one was meant to be inside that night. Peter Grant simply had the misfortune of doing his job too well." Eleanor felt the weight of the truth settle over the room like smoke. "And you have known this the entire time?" "I found the papers when I was 17, going through my father's desk after he fell ill," Edmund said. I confronted him, and he did not deny it. He only told me that some truths, once spoken, cannot be unspoken, and that the Hale name would not survive the telling. He made me promise to protect it, whatever the cost, and then he died before I could ever decide whether I believed he deserved that promise. So you inherited his guilt along with his title. I inherited a dead man's family who never received justice, and a living family who would be destroyed if that justice ever came, Edmund said, his voice breaking slightly on the word justice, as though he had turned it over in his mind 1,000 times without ever finding peace in either direction. Finch has known since the beginning. He was the one who lit the fire after all. Every year, his price for silence grows higher, because he understands I have no choice but to pay it. Eleanor sat across from him, the papers spread between them like an open wound. Does Peter Grant have family still living? A widow, Edmund said, and a daughter, who would have been a child when it happened. I do not know where they live now. I have never had the courage to find out, because I feared what I would do if I ever looked them in the eye. The confession hung heavy in the air between them, and Eleanor found herself torn between the horror of what she had learned and a strange, reluctant compassion for the man sitting across from her, a man who had been 17 years old when he first carried this weight, far too young to have chosen any part of the burden crushing him now. You cannot keep paying Finch forever, she said finally. Charlotte told me the money is running low. What happens when it runs out entirely? Then he tells the world what my father did, and I lose everything, Edmund said simply. My title, my freedom, likely my life if the courts decide my silence made me as guilty as my father's original crime. And Charlotte loses the only home she has ever known, cast out with a ruined name, and no prospects left to her. There must be another way. I have spent 11 years searching for another way, Eleanor. There is none. Finch holds every piece of proof, and I hold nothing but a family name already stained beyond saving. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked to the window, staring out at the dark garden where Finch had vanished only nights before. An idea, dangerous and half-formed, was already taking shape in her mind, though she was not yet certain she had the courage to voice it aloud. What if the proof did not remain only in his hands, she said slowly. What if you had your own evidence, strong enough to expose him as the one who lit the fire, rather than merely the man your father hired to do it? If the courts saw Finch as the true hand behind Peter Grant's death, your father's guilt becomes secondary to a killer walking free for over a decade. Edmund looked up at her, something sharp and calculating entering his exhausted eyes for the first time since she had entered the room. You are suggesting I turn his own crime against him. I am suggesting you stop paying a murderer to protect a dead man's mistake, Eleanor said. Your father is gone. Whatever guilt he carried died with him, but Finch is still here, still profiting from that death every single year, and he is the one truly deserving of whatever justice finally arrives. If I expose him, he exposes everything in return. There is no scenario where my father's name remains untouched. Perhaps your father's name does not deserve to remain untouched, Eleanor said gently, but yours might survive it. If the story told is one of a son finally choosing justice over silence, rather than a family forever hiding behind a murderer's threats. Edmund said nothing for a long while, staring at the papers on his desk as though seeing them for the first time in years, instead of merely enduring their weight. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something Eleanor had not heard from him before, a fragile, dangerous kind of hope. It would mean facing Finch directly. He will not simply hand over his own guilt without a fight. Then we prepare for the fight, Eleanor said, rather than waiting each year to see how much higher his price will climb before he finally decides silence is no longer worth selling. That night they worked together in the study long after Charlotte had gone to bed, sorting through every scrap of paper Edmund's father had left behind, searching for anything that might tie Finch directly to the fire rather than merely to the payments that followed it. Eleanor found herself surprised by how naturally they fell into partnership, how quickly the distance that had defined their marriage since its first cold carriage ride began to close under the shared weight of a single dangerous purpose. They found little that first night beyond confirmation of what they already knew, but Eleanor noticed something else growing between them in the hours spent bent over the same candlelit desk. Edmund spoke more freely than she had ever heard him speak, sharing memories of his father, his own guilt, his fear that he had inherited not just a secret, but a stain no amount of good intention could ever fully wash away. She listened without judgment, offering steady presence rather than easy comfort, and somewhere in the depths of that long night, she realized she no longer viewed him as a stranger she had married out of desperation, but as a man she had genuinely begun to care for, secrets and all. "Why are you helping me?" Edmund asked her near dawn. his voice rough with exhaustion. "You could have taken these papers to a magistrate the moment you found them. You could have freed yourself from this marriage and let the consequences fall wherever they wished." "I considered it," Eleanor admitted honestly. "But I do not believe you are the man who lit that fire, Edmund. I believe you are a man who has spent his entire adult life trying to survive a crime he did not commit. And I find I cannot walk away from that kind of quiet suffering, not when I have the chance to help end it instead." He reached across the desk and took her hand, the same way he had the night before, though this time neither of them pulled away. "Whatever happens when we finally confront him," he said quietly, "I am glad it will not be alone." Their fragile alliance was tested only 2 days later, when a note arrived at Hale House bearing no signature, delivered by an unfamiliar boy who vanished before anyone could question him. Edmund read it in silence, his face growing pale once more, before he handed it wordlessly to Eleanor. The message was short and unmistakably threatening. Finch knew they had been searching through the old papers. He knew, somehow, that Eleanor had visited the village and spoken with Margaret Call about the fire, and he was demanding a final, enormous sum, delivered within the week, or he would take everything he knew directly to the authorities himself, framing the story however best suited his own protection. "He is frightened," Eleanor said, reading the note twice over. "A confident man does not demand payment this quickly, this desperately. He knows we are close to something that threatens him. Or he simply intends to bleed us dry before destroying us regardless," Edmund said grimly. "Then we do not give him the chance to choose the ending," Eleanor said, folding the note carefully and setting it aside. "We find the proof he fears we already have, before the week runs out, and we bring the truth to the authorities ourselves, on our own terms, rather than his." Edmund studied her for a long moment, something like awe mixing with the fear still etched across his features. "You are far braver than I ever expected my convenient bride to be." "You did not marry a convenient bride, my lord," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You married a woman who refuses to spend her life standing quietly in the shadow of someone else's secret. It is time Gerald Finch learned that lesson as well." Outside, the sky had begun to lighten toward morning, and somewhere beyond the estate's boundary wall, Eleanor knew Finch was already planning his next move, unaware that the woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a convenient disguise for Edmund's household expenses had become, in the space of a few short weeks, the single greatest threat to everything he had spent a decade building on the back of a dead man's silence. The next morning, Eleanor proposed a plan that made Edmund's jaw tighten with worry, though he did not immediately refuse it. She would return to the village, this time seeking out Peter Grant's widow directly, hoping the woman might hold some piece of knowledge from the years following the fire that could strengthen their case against Finch. Edmund insisted on accompanying her, unwilling to let her face the risk alone, and together they rode into the village under the pretense of a simple charitable visit. They found the widow, now an older woman named Ruth Grant, living in a small cottage at the edge of the village, supporting herself through needlework since her husband's death had left her with little else. She regarded them with open suspicion when Edmund introduced himself, her hands going still over the fabric in her lap. "Hale," she repeated, the name landing like a stone dropped into still water. I wondered if a hail would ever darken my door again. "I understand you have no reason to welcome us," Edmund said carefully, "but I have come to tell you the truth about the night your husband died, and to ask for whatever help you might be willing to give in finally bringing the man responsible to justice." Ruth Grant studied him for a long moment, searching his face for deception, before something in his evident distress seemed to convince her of his sincerity. She invited them inside, and over tea that none of them truly drank, she told them what she remembered of the weeks before the fire, how a rough-mannered man had come asking questions about the warehouse's night schedules, how her husband had mentioned him with unease in the days before he died. "I always believed there was more to that fire than the magistrate ever admitted," Ruth said. "But I was a poor woman with a young daughter, and no proof beyond a mother's instinct. No one listens to instinct when a wealthy family's name might be tied to the answer." "You have a daughter," Eleanor said gently. "Might she remember anything more? Even something small?" Ruth's expression grew guarded again. "She was young when it happened. I have tried to keep her away from this house, from this whole ugly business, ever since. I do not wish her dragged back into it now." "We do not intend to drag anyone into danger," Edmund said. "But if there is any proof remaining, anything at all, it may be the only chance to see the true culprit finally answer for what he did, rather than the family that merely failed to stop him in time." After a long silence, Ruth rose and crossed to an old chest in the corner of the room, retrieving a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. "My husband wrote to me nearly every week when his shifts kept him away overnight," she said, handing the bundle to Eleanor with visibly trembling hands. In the last letter, sent only days before the fire, he mentioned the man asking questions by name. I never showed it to anyone. I did not know who could be trusted with it. Eleanor untied the ribbon carefully and scanned the faded handwriting, her pulse quickening as she found the passage Ruth had described. Peter Grant had written his wife's name for Gerald Finch clearly, along with a note of unease about the stranger's late-night visits to the warehouse grounds in the days before his death. It was not a full confession, but paired with the papers already in Edmund's possession, it formed a chain strong enough to finally implicate Finch directly in the planning of the fire, rather than merely in its aftermath. This could change everything, Eleanor said quietly, looking up at Ruth with genuine gratitude. Thank you. I know this cannot undo what you lost, but it may finally bring the truth into the light. Ruth's eyes filled with tears she did not bother hiding. I have waited 11 years for someone to care enough to ask. I only hope it is not too late to matter. They left the cottage with the letter carefully tucked away, riding back toward Hale House in a silence heavier with purpose than fear. Edmund glanced at Eleanor several times along the road, as though seeing her anew in the wake of what they had just uncovered together. You gave her something today that I never managed to give her in 11 years, he said finally. Someone willing to listen without flinching from the truth. We gave her that together, Eleanor corrected gently. This was never something either of us could have managed alone. Back at the estate, they spent the remainder of the day organizing everything they had gathered, the old papers from the locked desk, Ruth's letter, and Margaret Call's account from the village inn, building a case methodical enough to withstand whatever denial Finch would surely offer once confronted. Charlotte joined them by evening, her earlier nervousness replaced by a quiet, steady determination that mirrored her brother's own. If this works, Charlotte said, studying the assembled evidence spread across the study table, we might finally be free of him. If it works, Edmund said, we will owe that freedom entirely to Eleanor's refusal to accept a comfortable silence in place of the truth. Eleanor said nothing to that, though something warm settled in her chest at the words, a feeling she had not expected to find inside a marriage that had begun as nothing more than a desperate transaction between two frightened families. Whatever came next, whatever danger Finch still posed before this was finally resolved, she understood now that she no longer stood beside Edmund out of obligation or convenience. She stood beside him because she had chosen to, fully and without reservation, and she intended to see this fight through to its end, whatever it demanded of either of them before Gerald Finch finally answered for the crime he had spent 11 years hiding behind another man's guilt. Smoke curled from a small fire burning in the metal bin outside the stable when Eleanor rounded the corner of Hale House at dusk, and her stomach dropped the moment she recognized the papers being fed into the flames. She broke into a run, reaching the bin just as the last of Ruth Grant's letter curled black at the edges. Stop, she cried out, but it was already too late. A stable hand stood frozen beside the fire, a look of confusion crossing his young face. Lord Hale told me to burn anything left in the old study bin, the boy stammered. I did not know it was important, my lady. Eleanor's hands trembled as she stared at the ashes, the proof they had gathered so carefully now scattered as smoke into the evening air. She turned and ran toward the house, fear and fury tangled together in her chest, and found Edmund in the study exactly where she expected, his face pale and drawn as he stared at an empty space on his desk where the evidence had been laid out only hours before. Where are the papers? She demanded, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Finch was here, Edmund said, his voice hollow. While we were at supper, he must have slipped in through the servants' entrance. He took everything, Eleanor, the letters, the old records, all of it. The weight of the loss settled over her like a physical blow. Weeks of careful work, a grieving widow's trust finally given, all of it gone in a single afternoon, while they sat unaware only rooms away. How did he know where to find it? I do not know, Edmund said, and something in his voice made her look at him more closely, a flicker of doubt she had not seen from him before. Only 4 people knew the evidence was gathered in this room, you, myself, Charlotte, and Mrs. Fenwick. Eleanor felt the accusation forming before he spoke it aloud, and something cold settled in her chest at the direction his thoughts had taken. You cannot believe one of us betrayed you. I do not want to believe it, Edmund said, running a hand through his hair, exhaustion and fear making his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. But someone told him, Eleanor, someone in this house. It was not me, she said quietly, though the accusation, even unspoken directly at her, stung more deeply than she expected. She had given up everything to help him, had sat with a grieving widow and carried her trust home carefully in both hands, and now found herself standing beneath the shadow of his suspicion regardless. I know, Edmund said, softening slightly, though the fear in his eyes did not fully fade. "I know it was not you, but I do not know who else it could have been, and that uncertainty is its own kind of danger." They spent the remainder of the evening questioning the household staff, though nothing conclusive emerged beyond frightened denials and confused faces. Mrs. Fenwick swore she had spoken of the papers to no one. Charlotte, tearful and shaken by the mere suggestion, insisted just as firmly on her own innocence. By the time the house finally settled into an uneasy quiet, Edmund and Eleanor sat alone in the study once more, the ashes outside still smoldering faintly in the dark. "We start again," Eleanor said finally, breaking the heavy silence between them. "Start again with what?" Edmund said bitterly. "The proof is gone. Finch holds every advantage now, and worse, he knows exactly how close we came to exposing him. He will not underestimate us again." "Then we do not give him the chance to prepare further," Eleanor said. "Ruth Grant remembers what her husband wrote. She can testify to its contents even without the letter itself, if it comes to that. Margaret Call remembers what she told me of the fire. Memory cannot be burned, Edmund, even when paper can." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that had been building quietly between them since the night she first bound his wound with a strip of her own robe. "You do not give up easily." "I have very little left to lose by continuing to try," she said simply. "And a great deal, I have come to realize, that I stand to lose if I stop." The admission hung between them, more honest than either had intended, and Edmund crossed the small distance separating their chairs, kneeling before her, the way a man kneels before something he has only recently understood he cannot afford to lose. "When I married you," he said quietly, "I told myself it was only ever meant to be an arrangement, a necessary disguise for a debt I could not otherwise explain. I did not expect to find myself grateful for your presence in this house, beyond what convenience required. I did not expect to find myself thinking of you long after you have left a room, wondering when you might return to it." Eleanor's breath caught, uncertain how to answer honesty she had not expected from a man who had spent so long guarding every word he offered her. "I did not expect to care for the stranger I married either," she admitted. "I thought I would spend this marriage simply surviving it. I did not think I would spend it beginning to love the man at its center." The word love settled between them, fragile and unfamiliar, and for a long moment neither of them moved, as though speaking further might shatter something too new to withstand careless handling. Then Edmund reached up and gently touched her face, and she did not pull away, and something that had been building quietly beneath every careful conversation and shared danger finally found its way fully into the open between them. Their fragile happiness, however, did not last uninterrupted. 3 days later, a second note arrived, this one more chilling than the first, informing Edmund that Finch now possessed not only the burned evidence's original counterparts, kept safely elsewhere all along, but also new information entirely, details of Eleanor's visit to Ruth Grant and Margaret Call, framed as proof that Edmund's new wife had been actively working to destroy his family from within. "He intends to turn this against us," Edmund said, reading the note with growing horror. "He will claim you conspired against my family's name, that our marriage was never genuine, that you sought only to expose old scandal for reasons of your own." "No one who knows the truth would believe that," Eleanor said, though a thread of fear ran through her voice despite her effort to sound certain. "Finch does not need the truth believed, only doubted enough to protect himself," Edmund said grimly. "If he can make our marriage appear a fraud built on hidden motives rather than genuine partnership, any evidence we bring forward becomes suspect by association. He is not merely threatening exposure anymore. He is threatening to destroy the one thing in this house he has not yet managed to poison." Eleanor understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how dangerous their position had become. It was no longer simply a matter of proving Finch guilty of an old crime. Now, whatever trust and tenderness had grown quietly between herself and Edmund stood equally at risk, threatened by a man desperate enough to burn genuine happiness alongside old evidence if it meant preserving his own freedom a little longer. "Then we make certain he cannot succeed at either," she said, steadying herself against the fear rising in her chest. "We do not merely defend ourselves against his lies, Edmund. We finish what we started, and we finish it before he finds another way to burn what remains of the truth between us." Edmund took her hand, his grip firm despite the exhaustion still etched across his face. "Whatever comes next, I do not intend to face it doubting you, whatever lies Finch attempts to spread. I know now what is real between us, Eleanor, and I will not let him take that from me the way he has taken so much else." Outside, the night had grown fully dark, and somewhere beyond the estate's boundaries, Gerald Finch was already preparing his next move. unaware that the very tactic he intended to use against them, painting their marriage as a fraud built on hidden motives, had instead revealed to both Edmund and Eleanor exactly how much they now stood to lose, and exactly how far they were both willing to go to protect it. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find Charlotte waiting outside her door, her face pale with an urgency that pulled Eleanor fully awake before she had even risen from bed. "I think I know who told Finch about the papers," Charlotte said quietly, glancing down the corridor as though afraid of being overheard even now. "I did not want to believe it, but I saw something last night I cannot explain away any longer." "Who?" Eleanor asked, pulling on her robe. "Mrs. Fenwick received a letter 2 days before the papers were burned," Charlotte said. "I saw her hide it quickly when I entered the kitchen, and I thought nothing of it at the time. But last night, I saw her speaking with a man near the boundary wall, well after the household had gone to sleep. I could not see his face clearly, but something in the way he stood reminded me of the man who fled through the study window the night Edmund was wounded." Eleanor's mind raced through the implications. Mrs. Fenwick had served the Hale family for years, long enough to be trusted implicitly, yet trust built over years could still be broken by desperation, debt, or fear of her own. "Have you told Edmund?" "Not yet. I did not wish to accuse her without more than a glimpse in the dark to support it." Together, they found Edmund in the breakfast room and relayed what Charlotte had seen. His expression darkened immediately, though he did not act rashly, choosing instead to summon Mrs. Fenwick quietly to the study, rather than confronting her before the rest of the staff. When she arrived, her composure cracked far more quickly than Eleanor expected, and within minutes of careful, measured questioning from Edmund, the housekeeper broke into tears, admitting everything in a rush of guilt and fear. "My son owes money to men in London," she confessed, her hands twisting in her apron. "Finch found him first, threatened him, and told me the debt would vanish the moment I told him what was gathered in this study. I never meant harm to this family, my lord. I have served you since you were a boy, but I could not watch my son suffer for a debt he could not repay." Edmund's jaw tightened, torn between the anger of betrayal and an understanding born of his own long entanglement with Finch's particular brand of cruelty. "You should have come to me," he said finally. "I know better than anyone in this house what it means to be cornered by that man's threats." "I was ashamed," Mrs. Fenwick said, "and afraid you would dismiss me the moment you learned the truth." Eleanor watched Edmund carefully, curious how he would respond, and found herself unexpectedly moved when he chose mercy over punishment, promising to help settle the housekeeper's son's debt directly, rather than casting her out into a world that had already shown her how little mercy it contained. "We are all being squeezed by the same hand," Edmund said quietly, once Mrs. Fenwick had gone, her relief evident even through her lingering shame. "Finch does not simply threaten me. He finds every weakness in every person connected to this house, and presses until something breaks. I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected my own staff from him the way I have tried, however imperfectly, to protect my own family." "You cannot protect everyone from every danger alone," Eleanor said gently. "That is precisely why this cannot remain your burden only. Whatever Finch intends next, he will find fewer cracks to exploit if we face this together, openly, rather than each of us guarding our own fears in separate silence." Edmund nodded slowly, something resolving behind his tired eyes. "Then let us make certain there are no more silences left in this house for him to exploit. Whatever he throws at us next, we face it as partners, not as a man hiding secrets from the wife he married only to disguise them." Eleanor reached for his hand, and this time neither of them hesitated. "Partners," she agreed. "In everything, from now until whatever end this finally reaches." The words settled between them with quiet weight, a promise made not out of desperation or convenience, but out of a trust that had grown slowly and honestly through fire, fear, and the shared determination to see justice finally done, whatever the cost to either of them before Gerald Finch was finally forced to answer for everything he had built upon another family's suffering. A carriage stood waiting outside Ruth Grant's cottage when Eleanor arrived the following week, and the sight of it, dark and unfamiliar, sent a bolt of fear through her chest before she had even climbed down from her own. She rushed inside to find Ruth pale and shaking, a folded note clutched in her trembling hands. "He was here," Ruth said, before Eleanor could even ask. "Gerald Finch himself, not an hour ago. He told me if I speak a single word of what I remember to anyone else, he will make certain my daughter loses her position in the household where she now works. He knows her name. He knows where she serves. He knows everything, Lady Hale, and I am afraid." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Finch had moved beyond threatening Edmund's family alone. He was now reaching directly into the lives of everyone who might testify against him. using fear as efficiently as he had once used fire. "You do not have to decide anything today," Eleanor said, taking Ruth's trembling hands in her own. "But please know that whatever choice you make, we will not let harm come to you or your daughter because of it. You have already given more than anyone should have to give." Ruth nodded, though the fear did not fully leave her eyes, and Eleanor rode back to Hale House with a growing sense that time was running dangerously short. Finch was no longer content merely threatening exposure. He was actively working to dismantle their case witness by witness, fear by fear, and she understood now that whatever plan they eventually enacted would need to happen swiftly, before he silenced every remaining voice willing to speak the truth. She found Edmund in the study upon her return, and the moment she relayed what had happened at Ruth's cottage, his expression hardened into something she had not seen from him before, a controlled, deliberate anger that replaced the fear he had carried since the night his study window shattered. "He has gone too far," Edmund said. "Threatening a grieving widow's daughter crosses a line even he has not dared cross before. This ends now, Eleanor. I will not allow him to terrorize innocent people simply because they were brave enough to help us." "What do you intend to do?" "I intend to confront him directly," Edmund said. "Not with hidden evidence he can burn, or witnesses he can silence, but face to face, on my own terms, where he cannot hide behind shadows and stolen letters any longer." Eleanor's stomach twisted with fear at the thought. That is precisely what he wants. A confrontation alone, where he holds every advantage and no one else witnesses whatever happens between you. "Then I will not go alone," Edmund said, meeting her eyes. "I will bring you, and Charlotte, and whatever remaining proof we still possess, and I will force him to answer for everything in front of witnesses he cannot simply threaten into silence afterward." They spent the following 2 days preparing carefully, gathering what remained of their evidence, arranging for the local magistrate, a fair-minded man named Frederick Lowe who had known Edmund's father only distantly, to be present nearby, ready to intervene the moment genuine proof of Finch's guilt could be presented openly. Eleanor rode once more to the village, this time not to gather further evidence but to warn Ruth and Margaret that a confrontation was coming, and to ask, gently, whether either woman would be willing to stand as witness if the moment finally arrived. Margaret agreed without hesitation, her long resentment of Finch's shadowy presence in the village finally finding an outlet after years of quiet suspicion. Ruth, after a long, anguished silence, agreed as well, though her hands shook as she spoke the words. "My husband deserved justice 11 years ago," she said. "I will not let fear rob him of it any longer, whatever it costs me now." 2 nights before the planned confrontation, disaster nearly struck. Eleanor woke to the sound of breaking glass below her window and rushed downstairs to find a rock had been thrown through the drawing room window, a note tied around it warning them plainly to abandon whatever plan they were preparing, or watch it end in far greater tragedy than an old fire ever had. Edmund arrived moments later, his face grim as he read the message. "He knows we intend to move against him," Edmund said. "Someone must have followed you to the village again, or overheard something within these walls despite our care. Or he is simply guessing, hoping fear alone will make us retreat," Eleanor said, though her own hands trembled slightly as she set the note aside. "We cannot allow it to work, Edmund. If we hesitate now, he will only grow bolder, and Ruth and Margaret will have risked everything for nothing." Charlotte, who had rushed down at the sound of breaking glass, wrapped her arms tightly around herself. "What if he truly means to hurt someone this time? He has already drawn blood once in this very house." "Then we take every precaution available to us," Edmund said, though the fear in his own eyes was impossible to fully hide. "We involve the magistrate now, before the meeting rather than only during it, and we ensure constables are already stationed nearby, watching, before Finch ever arrives to suspect a trap." At Shuel, Eleanor rode out the next morning to speak with Magistrate Lowe directly, explaining everything they had gathered and the danger now threatening not only their household but the witnesses who had bravely agreed to speak. Lowe listened with careful, measured attention, and though he cautioned that memory and testimony alone rarely secured swift convictions, he agreed to have his constables positioned near the old warehouse on the appointed night, ready to act the moment sufficient proof was spoken aloud in their hearing. Returning to Hale House that afternoon, Eleanor found Edmund pacing the length of the study, unable to settle, the strain of the coming confrontation etched plainly across his face. "If something happens to you tomorrow night," he said, the moment she entered, "if he decides violence is preferable to exposure, I do not know that I could forgive myself for allowing you anywhere near that warehouse." "And if something happens to you," Eleanor said, crossing the room to stand before him, "do Do you imagine I would forgive myself for staying safely behind while you faced him alone? We agreed to be partners, Edmund. That promise does not bend simply because the danger has grown sharper. He studied her for a long moment, fear and love tangled visibly behind his eyes, before finally nodding, accepting what he could not change. Then we face it together, exactly as we said we would. On the appointed evening, Edmund sent word to Finch through the same rough channels the man had always used to demand payment, requesting a final meeting at the old warehouse site itself, the very place where Peter Grant had died, claiming he intended to deliver the sum Finch had demanded in his last threatening note. Eleanor argued fiercely against the location at first, certain it invited danger beyond what any of them could control, but Edmund remained resolute. He will not suspect an ambush at a place he believes still frightens me too deeply to willingly return to, Edmund said, and there is a certain justice in finally confronting him where Peter Grant lost his life, rather than in the comfort of my own study, where he has always held the advantage. The night of the meeting arrived cold and clouded, the moon hidden behind heavy gray clouds that made the abandoned warehouse feel even more ominous than its ruined walls already suggested. Eleanor stood beside Edmund near the entrance, Charlotte a few steps behind them, while Magistrate Lowe and 2 constables waited concealed nearby, close enough to intervene the moment true proof was spoken aloud. Finch arrived precisely at the appointed hour, emerging from the shadows with the same rough confidence Eleanor remembered from the night he had wounded Edmund in the study. He carried no visible weapon this time, though something in his posture suggested he trusted his own cunning far more than any blade. "You have finally decided to be sensible," Finch said, his eyes moving between Edmund and Eleanor with cold amusement. "I confess I did not expect your new bride to accompany you, though perhaps she has finally learned her place in all this." "I am not here to deliver payment, Finch," Edmund said, his voice steady despite the fear Eleanor could still see tightening the muscles of his jaw. "I am here to end this. Tonight, permanently." Finch's amusement flickered, replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. "You forget who holds the proof of your father's guilt, Lord Hale. Whatever brave speech you have prepared changes nothing about the papers I still possess, or the ruin they will bring the moment I choose to release them." "The papers prove my father paid you," Edmund said. "They do not prove you lit the fire yourself, nor that you knew a man would die inside that building when you did. But Ruth Grant remembers her husband's final letter, describing a stranger asking questions about the warehouse's night schedule days before the blaze. And Margaret Call remembers seeing you near that warehouse the very week it burned. Alone, either account might mean little. Together, they place you at the center of a murder you have spent 11 years blaming quietly on a dead man too guilty of cowardice to ever defend himself." Finch's expression shifted rapidly through disbelief, calculation, and finally something close to genuine alarm, as Ruth and Margaret stepped forward from the shadows where they had been waiting, both women's faces set with a determination that had clearly cost them dearly to summon. "You threatened my daughter," Ruth said, her voice trembling but clear in the cold night air. "You have taken enough from my family already. I will not let fear silence me any longer." "This is nothing," Finch said, though the confidence in his voice had begun to crack visibly. "Rumors and memories, nothing more. No court will convict a man on the word of a grieving widow and a village gossip." "Perhaps not alone," Magistrate Lowe said, stepping out from concealment with the 2 constables flanking him. "But combined with the confession you are about to offer regarding the payments made to you by the elder Lord Hale, and the testimony freely given here tonight, I believe we have more than sufficient grounds to open a formal investigation into Peter Grant's death, Mr. Finch." Finch's eyes darted between the gathered witnesses, searching desperately for an escape that did not exist. For a terrible moment, Eleanor feared he might turn violent, might lash out the way he had the night he wounded Edmund, and she instinctively stepped closer to her husband's side, ready to defend him however she could. But Finch, faced finally with witnesses he could not threaten into silence, and evidence he could no longer simply burn away, seemed to collapse inward rather than outward, years of careful cruelty crumbling into something small and desperate. "I never intended for anyone to die," he said, his voice suddenly hollow, stripped of its usual menace. "The old lord wanted the warehouse gone, wanted his rival ruined before the debt came due. I did not know Grant would be inside. I have carried that alongside every year of silver I have collected since, whatever you choose to believe of me now." "Then you will have the chance to explain that to a proper court," Magistrate Lowe said, "rather than continuing to hold an entire family hostage to a crime you alone chose to commit." For a moment it seemed Finch might simply accept his fate. Then, without warning, he lunged sideways toward the darkened edge of the warehouse, attempting to bolt into the shadows where the ruined building's collapsed sections offered a dozen paths of escape into the night. Edmund moved instinctively, catching Finch's arm before he could vanish into the dark, and the two men grappled for a brief, desperate moment, the sound of their struggle echoing off the warehouse's broken walls. Eleanor's heart lodged in her throat as she watched, torn between rushing forward and the knowledge that her interference might only endanger Edmund further. The constables reached them within seconds, pulling Finch away and pinning his arms before he could do more than tear a gash in Edmund's sleeve, though this time, mercifully, no blade had been involved. "Let go of me," Finch snarled, thrashing uselessly against the constable's grip. "You have no true proof, only whispers and an old woman's grief." "We have enough," Magistrate Lowe said calmly, "to hold you until a proper trial determines the rest, and I suspect, once the full investigation begins, a great deal more will surface than whispers alone." Finch's protests faded into sullen silence as the constables led him toward a waiting cart, and Eleanor finally allowed herself to breathe fully again, rushing to Edmund's side to examine the tear in his sleeve, relieved to find only a shallow scratch beneath it rather than anything more serious. "You should not have grabbed him," she said, her voice unsteady with lingering fear, even as her hands checked him carefully for further injury. "He could have turned that struggle into something far worse." "I could not let him disappear into that darkness," Edmund said, still slightly breathless, "not after everything it cost to bring him this far into the light." The constables moved forward to take Finch into custody, and Eleanor watched, her heart still pounding, as the man who had haunted every corner of Hale House since her wedding night was finally led away in chains, his threats reduced to nothing more than the desperate protests of a man who had finally run out of shadows to hide within. Edmund stood beside her in stunned silence for a long moment after Finch had been taken, as though he could not quite believe the weight he had carried for 11 years had finally, truly lifted from his shoulders. When he finally turned to look at her, there were tears in his eyes he did not bother hiding. "It is over," he said, his voice rough with disbelief. "After all these years, Eleanor, it is finally over." "Not entirely," she said gently, reaching for his hand. "There will still be a trial, still be scrutiny of your father's name, still be difficult questions the family must answer in the coming months. But you no longer face any of it alone, and you no longer face it hiding, Edmund. That is its own kind of freedom, whatever the courts eventually decide." Charlotte embraced her brother tightly, tears streaming freely down her face, while Ruth and Margaret stood nearby, exhausted but visibly lighter. The burden of 11 years of silence finally set down after being carried for far too long by people who had never deserved to bear it in the first place. As they walked back toward the waiting carriages beneath the slowly clearing night sky, Edmund kept Eleanor's hand firmly in his own, and she understood, with a certainty that settled warm and steady in her chest, that whatever challenges remained ahead, they would face them exactly as they had faced this final confrontation, together, honestly, and without the shadow of secret standing between them any longer. News of Gerald Finch's arrest reached London within days, and by the following week, Hale House found itself besieged not by Finch's threats but by something almost as dangerous, the sudden, ravenous attention of society. Newspapers printed lurid speculation about the old fire, about the elder Lord Hale's possible guilt, about a young bride who had apparently uncovered a decade-old murder within weeks of her own wedding. Invitations that had once flowed steadily to Hale House stopped entirely, replaced instead by pointed silence from families who had once courted Edmund's friendship. Charlotte took the shift hardest, weeping quietly over letters from friends who no longer wished to correspond with a family now tangled in scandal and suspicion. Edmund grew grim and withdrawn again, though this time Eleanor recognized the difference in his silence, no longer the guarded fear of a man hiding something, but the raw exhaustion of a man who had finally exposed the truth only to watch the world punish him for it regardless. "Perhaps it would have been easier to let it remain buried," Charlotte said one evening, her voice thick with unshed tears. "At least then we were merely whispered about. Now we are printed in every paper in London." "Easier does not mean right," Eleanor said gently, though she understood the weight behind her sister-in-law's despair. "Peter Grant is finally being spoken of by name, after 11 years of silence. That matters, Charlotte, whatever the papers choose to print about the rest of us in the meantime." Edmund, overhearing from the doorway, entered quietly and sat beside his sister, taking her hand. "I know this is a heavy price to pay for truth. I would spare you this if I could, but I will not apologize for finally giving Peter Grant's family the justice they were owed, whatever it costs our own name in the process." The trial itself, when it finally began a month later, drew crowds thick enough to fill the courthouse gallery well beyond its usual capacity. Eleanor sat beside Edmund each day, her hand often clasped tightly in his beneath the wooden bench, as witness after witness took the stand. Ruth Grant testified with a steady, quiet dignity that silenced even the most skeptical members of the gallery, describing her husband's final letter and the years of grief that had followed his death. Margaret Call confirmed what she had seen near the warehouse the week of the fire, her plain village manner lending her words an unshakable honesty the prosecution used to great effect. When Edmund himself took the stand, he spoke plainly of finding his father's papers as a young man, of the promise he had been forced to make, of the years spent paying Finch's demands out of fear rather than any desire to protect true guilt. He did not attempt to excuse his father entirely, nor did he seek pity for himself, offering instead a steady, honest account that left the courtroom notably quieter than it had been for any testimony before his. Finch's defense, when it finally came, crumbled quickly under the weight of evidence assembled against him. His own words on the night of his arrest, overheard and recorded by the constables present, combined with the testimony of both women and the surviving papers Edmund still possessed regarding years of payment, proved more than sufficient to secure a conviction. The jury deliberated for less than a day, before returning a verdict that finally, after 11 long years, named Gerald Finch responsible for the death of Peter Grant. The courtroom erupted into murmurs the moment the verdict was read, and Eleanor watched Ruth Grant, seated across the gallery, press a trembling hand to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face at last, tears that seemed to carry more relief than grief after so many years of unanswered waiting. Outside the courthouse, reporters pressed close, shouting questions about the Hale family's future, about whether Edmund intended to step back from society entirely, about what became of a man whose father's crime had finally been dragged into public light. Edmund answered none of them directly, instead guiding Eleanor and Charlotte toward their waiting carriage, though one question, shouted louder than the rest, followed them even as the carriage door closed. "Lord Hale, was your marriage ever anything more than a convenient disguise for your family's secrets?" The question hung in the air even after the carriage began moving, and Eleanor felt Edmund's hand tighten around her own. She turned to find him watching her, something raw and vulnerable in his expression despite the exhaustion of the long trial. "I have wondered," he said quietly, "whether you regret any of this, whether, given the chance again, you would still have said yes to a stranger's desperate proposal, knowing everything it would eventually cost you." Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering, unwilling to offer empty reassurance when honesty mattered so much more between them now. "I will not pretend the scandal does not frighten me, Edmund, or that I do not mourn the quiet, ordinary life I once imagined for myself before your letter arrived at my family's door. But I do not regret marrying you. I do not regret any of what we uncovered together, or what it cost to finally see it through. If given the choice again, knowing everything I know now, I would still choose you, even knowing what people will say of us for years to come." "Especially knowing it," Eleanor said, "because I would rather stand beside a man honest enough to finally face the truth, however painful, than one content to hide behind silence and stolen peace for the rest of his life. Whatever the papers print, whatever society decides to whisper, I know the truth of who you are, Edmund Hale, and it is not the man they are trying to paint in those headlines." Something shifted visibly in his expression, the last remnants of doubt finally giving way to something steadier, more certain. He reached up and gently touched her face, the same gesture he had offered the night they first admitted what had grown between them, though this time it carried none of the fragile uncertainty of that earlier moment. "I love you," he said simply, the words arriving without hesitation for the first time since their wedding day. "Not out of gratitude for what you have done, though I owe you more than I could ever repay, but because you have shown me, every single day since that first carriage ride, exactly the kind of partner I did not know I needed until you were already standing beside me." "I love you too," Eleanor said, and the words felt as natural and certain as anything she had ever spoken. "I did not expect to find this, marrying a stranger, to save my family from ruin, but I would not trade what we have built together for any easier, quieter life I might have imagined instead." Not long after the trial, an invitation arrived from one of the very families who had once distanced themselves from the Hale name, requesting their presence at a grand autumn ball in London, the kind of gathering Eleanor knew would be filled with curious eyes and whispered questions about everything the newspapers had printed. Edmund hesitated over the invitation for days, uncertain whether attending would invite renewed scrutiny or finally settle it. "We do not have to go," he told her one evening. "I would not blame you for wishing to avoid a room full of people eager to study us like some curiosity." "I think we should go," Eleanor said, surprising him, Not to prove anything to them, but to prove to ourselves that we no longer need to hide from anyone's judgment. We have nothing left to be ashamed of, Edmund. Let them look, let them whisper. We know the truth of what we survived, and that truth no longer frightens me. They attended the ball together 3 weeks later, and Eleanor felt every curious glance that followed them through the crowded ballroom, felt the whispers that trailed in their wake as they moved among London's finest families. But she held her head high, her hand steady on Edmund's arm, and slowly, gathering by gathering, conversation by conversation, she watched the curiosity in the room shift into something closer to admiration. A young woman who had married a stranger and uncovered a murderer within her own household was, it turned out, far more interesting to London society than a scandal alone could ever be. By the end of the evening, Edmund leaned close to murmur in her ear, "I believe you have single-handedly restored our family's standing more thoroughly in one evening than years of careful silence ever managed." "I did not do it for our standing," Eleanor said, smiling. "I did it because I am no longer willing to shrink from anything, least of all a room full of people who once believed our marriage was built on nothing more than convenience and secrets." They left the ball early, preferring the quiet of their own carriage and each other's company to the lingering formality of the evening. And as London's lights faded behind them on the road home, Eleanor rested her head against Edmund's shoulder, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely at peace with the life she had chosen. In the weeks that followed the trial's conclusion, society's harshest whispers gradually softened into something closer to grudging respect, as the true story of the Hale family's courage in finally exposing an old crime began to outweigh the scandal of the crime itself. Invitations slowly began arriving once more, though Edmund and Eleanor accepted few of them, finding they preferred the quiet company of Charlotte, Ruth Grant, whom Eleanor had grown genuinely fond of and continued visiting regularly, and each other, over the careful performances society had once demanded of them. Charlotte, freed at last from the weight of a secret she had carried since childhood, began to laugh more easily, to speak more openly with the small circle of friends who had proven their loyalty during the difficult months of scandal. She often joined Eleanor on visits to the village, and slowly, a genuine friendship grew between the sisters, bound now not by blood but by choice and shared survival. Not every shadow from the past faded quietly, however. 2 months after the trial's conclusion, a letter arrived at Hale House bearing an unfamiliar hand, warning Edmund that Finch had spoken to a fellow prisoner of hidden funds, money skimmed over the years from his dealings with the elder Lord Hale, and hinting that an associate outside prison walls might still attempt to use that knowledge against the family, hoping to extract one final payment before the matter was fully closed. Eleanor felt the old fear stir briefly in her chest upon reading it, a flicker of the anxious watchfulness that had defined her first weeks in this house. But where once such a letter might have sent her pacing sleepless corridors alone, she now found herself instead crossing directly to Edmund's study, the letter in hand, unwilling to let even the memory of old secrecy take root between them again. "Another threat," Edmund said grimly, reading it over. "I confess I hoped we had seen the last of this particular danger." "Then we do exactly what we did before," Eleanor said. "We do not hide it, and we do not face it alone. We take it directly to Magistrate Lowe, and we make certain whoever this associate is understands there is no more silence left in this house for them to exploit." They rode to see Lowe the following morning, and within a fortnight, the magistrate's careful inquiries uncovered a former associate of Finch's, a man who had helped move stolen funds in the years following the fire, hoping to frighten the family into one last payment before disappearing entirely. Forewarned and unafraid, Edmund and Eleanor cooperated fully with the investigation, and the man was apprehended attempting to flee the county before he could act on his threats. Whatever remaining shadow Finch's crimes had cast over Hale House finally, truly lifted in the weeks that followed, the last loose thread of 11 years of secrecy cut cleanly away. "I keep waiting to feel afraid again," Eleanor admitted one evening, sitting beside Edmund in the study where so much of their story had unfolded, "and each time, I find the fear simply is not there anymore. I think, perhaps, we have finally outlasted it." "I think we outlasted it the moment we stopped facing it alone," Edmund said, drawing her closer. "Fear thrives in silence, Eleanor. You taught me that, whether you intended to or not, the very first night you refused to accept being kept in the dark." Ruth Grant visited Hale House not long after, bringing with her a small bundle of dried flowers from her cottage garden, a modest gift that meant more to Eleanor than any grand society offering ever could. "My daughter has kept her position," Ruth said, smiling for what Eleanor realized was perhaps the first time since they had met. "She writes to me now without fear of what might happen should the truth of her father's death ever be spoken aloud. I have you both to thank for that peace, more than I could ever properly express. You gave us the truth we needed to finally end this, Eleanor said, embracing the older woman warmly. We are the ones who owe you thanks, Ruth, for trusting us with something so painful, and for your husband's courage, all those years ago, simply for doing his work honestly, on a night that should never have cost him his life. As autumn settled over the estate, Hale House began to feel, for the first time since Eleanor's arrival, like a true home rather than a house full of locked doors and careful silences. Servants moved through its halls without flinching at closed study doors. Charlotte filled the drawing room with music once more, having set aside her earlier nervousness entirely in favor of genuine joy. And Edmund, freed finally of the weight he had carried since he was 17 years old, began to laugh more easily, to speak of the future rather than merely surviving the past. On a quiet evening nearly a year after Eleanor had first climbed into an unmarked carriage bound for a stranger's estate, she stood with Edmund in the same garden where Charlotte had once warned her that her brother was a frightened man rather than a cruel one. The roses Charlotte tended so carefully had bloomed fully now, filling the evening air with a sweetness that felt entirely at odds with the fear and secrecy that had once defined this house. "Do you remember what you told me?" Edmund asked. "The night I asked why you continued helping me, when you might have simply taken the papers to a magistrate and freed yourself from all of this entirely? I told you I did not believe you were the man who lit that fire," Eleanor said, smiling at the memory. "That I could not walk away from your quiet suffering once I understood it." "I have thought of that moment often," he said. "It was the first time I truly believed someone might choose to stand beside me, rather than simply enduring my presence out of necessity or obligation." "I did not marry you for love, Edmund," Eleanor said softly, taking his hand, "but I choose you now, every single day, entirely for love, and I intend to keep choosing you for as long as you will allow it." He drew her close, and beneath the fading evening light, surrounded by roses that had finally been given room to bloom freely after years of neglect, Edmund Hale kissed his wife not as the desperate stranger who had once needed her silence to survive, but as the man he had finally become, honest, steady, and entirely hers, with no secret left standing between them any longer, and no shadow remaining strong enough to threaten the life they had chosen to build together. A carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest arrived at Hale House on a bright spring morning nearly 2 years after Gerald Finch had first been led away in chains, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken instinctively at the sight of it, an old habit born from months of watching for danger that had never fully left her, even now that peace had settled so completely over the household. The visitor, however, brought no threat with him. He was a solicitor from London, representing the estate of a distant cousin of Ruth Grant's late husband, and he carried news that Peter Grant's name had finally, formally, been cleared of any suspicion that had ever lingered around the fire's original investigation, with a modest sum of compensation now settled upon Ruth and her daughter by order of the court, funded in part by the recovered assets seized from Finch's own hidden accounts. Eleanor read the solicitor's papers with tears gathering in her eyes, and she rode to the village that very afternoon to share the news with Ruth herself, finding the older woman weeping with a relief that had taken years longer than it should have to finally arrive. "I never thought I would live to see his name spoken with anything but suspicion," Ruth said, clutching the papers to her chest. "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything you and your husband have done, this final chapter included. You gave us the courage to finish what we started," Eleanor said. "This belongs to you as much as to us." Life at Hale House, in the years that followed, settled into a rhythm neither Edmund nor Eleanor could have imagined on the cold morning her family's debt had first arrived on their doorstep. Charlotte, blossoming fully now free of the shadow that had once defined her childhood, fell in love with a kind, steady gentleman named Henry Marlowe, a neighboring landowner who had stood loyally beside the family throughout the worst of the scandal, never once wavering in his friendship. Their wedding, held the following spring in the same small chapel where Edmund and Eleanor had married under far different circumstances, was filled with laughter and genuine celebration, a stark and welcome contrast to the quiet, fearful ceremony that had begun this story. Edmund used a portion of the estate's slowly recovering fortune to establish a small fund in Peter Grant's name, providing support to families of watchmen and laborers, injured or killed in accidents across the county. A quiet act of ongoing repair for a debt he understood could never be fully repaid, only honored through continued effort. He visited the fund's beneficiaries personally whenever he could, no longer the guarded, isolated man who had once refused to look strangers in the eye, but someone who had learned, through hard-won experience, the value of facing difficult truths directly rather than hiding from them. Eleanor, for her part, found unexpected purpose in managing the estate's growing charitable efforts alongside Edmund, her sharp mind for numbers finally given room to flourish fully rather than remaining hidden behind the modest expectations once placed upon her as an overlooked young woman with no fortune of her own. She corresponded regularly with Ruth Grant, their friendship deepening far beyond the circumstances that had first brought them together, and she often walked the same garden paths where Charlotte had once warned her that her brother was more frightened than cruel, marveling at how thoroughly that fear had finally been replaced by something steadier and infinitely more lasting. On the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, Edmund surprised her with a quiet dinner in the same dining room where they had once sat in cold, careful silence during their very first meal together as husband and wife. The candles were lit exactly as they had been that first uncomfortable evening, though everything else about the room, and about the two people seated within it, had changed entirely. "Do you remember this table?" Edmund asked, watching her across the familiar candlelight, "and how little either of us said to each other that first night?" "I remember thinking I had married the coldest man in England," Eleanor said, laughing softly at the memory. "I could not have imagined, sitting here that night, everything we would eventually build together." "Nor could I," Edmund admitted. "I remember thinking only of how to keep you at enough distance that you would never learn the truth I was so desperate to protect. I did not imagine, even for a moment, that the woman I married for convenience would become the very reason I finally found the courage to face that truth at all." He reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture that had once felt so unfamiliar between them, and now felt as natural as breathing. "I have thought often of what might have happened if you had chosen differently, that first night in the corridor, if you had taken what you overheard straight to a magistrate rather than choosing to wait, to watch, to eventually stand beside me instead. I thought of it too, in those early days," Eleanor admitted. "But I do not believe I ever truly considered it, not for long. Something in you, even then, told me the truth was more complicated than simple guilt, and I found I could not walk away without understanding it fully." "You saved more than my family's name," Edmund said quietly. "You saved me from becoming a man who spent his entire life hiding from the truth of his own inheritance. I do not know who I would have become, left alone with that secret for the rest of my days, but I do not think I would have become someone I could have respected." Eleanor rose from her seat and moved around the table to stand beside him, and he pulled her gently into his lap, an informality that would have scandalized the careful, guarded man she had married 3 years earlier. "You give me too much credit," she said softly. "I simply refuse to live blind in my own home." "Everything that followed, you built yourself, Edmund, through courage I am not certain I could have summoned in your place." "Then let us agree we built it together," he said, "as we have built everything else since that first cold carriage ride toward a house full of secrets." Outside, the spring evening settled gently over the estate. The same garden where danger had once lurked in every shadow, now filled instead with the quiet sounds of a household finally, fully at peace. Charlotte's laughter drifted faintly from the drawing room, where she sat with her new husband planning improvements to their own modest estate nearby. Somewhere in the village, Ruth Grant slept soundly for the first time in over a decade, no longer haunted by unanswered questions about her husband's death. And in the dining room where their story had first begun in cold, uncertain silence, Edmund and Eleanor Hale sat together in the warm glow of candlelight, no secrets left standing between them, no shadow strong enough any longer to threaten the life they had chosen, deliberately and completely, to build together. The following autumn brought news that filled the house with a different kind of joy entirely. Eleanor discovered she was carrying their first child, and she watched, with quiet wonder, as the news transformed her husband in ways she had not thought possible. The guarded, careful man who had once measured every word before speaking it, now spoke openly of his hopes for their child's future, of a life free from the secrets and fear that had shaped his own childhood so completely. "I want our children to grow up in a house with no locked doors," he told her one evening, his hand resting gently against the small curve of her stomach. "No corridors they are warned away from, no truths hidden behind careful silence. I want them to know they can ask any question and receive an honest answer, always." "They will," Eleanor promised him. "We have already proven that kind of house is possible, Edmund. We built it ourselves, out of the very rubble of the one that came before it." Charlotte, expecting her own first child only months behind Eleanor, spent long afternoons with her sister-in-law planning nursery furnishings and trading nervous, excited speculation about the futures awaiting their growing family. The two women had become genuine friends in the years since Finch's arrest, bound together by the shared history of surviving something that could easily have torn the family apart instead of drawing it closer. Ruth Grant visited often during those months, bringing small gifts for the coming children, her presence in the household now as natural and welcome as any blood relation. She had become, in her own quiet way, part of the family that had once been connected to her only through tragedy. And Eleanor cherished the friendship as one of the unexpected gifts that had grown from the darkest chapter of her marriage. When Eleanor's daughter was finally born on a cold morning the following winter, Edmund held the infant with a tenderness that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. All the careful guardedness that had once defined him, completely dissolved in the face of this small, new life neither of them had imagined possible during those first frightening weeks of their marriage. "What shall we name her?" he asked softly, still cradling their daughter close. "Grace," Eleanor said, the choice arriving without hesitation. "For everything that carried us through to this moment, and for Ruth, who taught us both what true grace looks like, even in the face of unimaginable loss." Edmund looked up at her, understanding immediately the weight behind the name, and nodded, his eyes bright with emotion he no longer felt any need to hide. "Grace Hale," he said softly, testing the name against his daughter's sleeping face. "I think that suits her perfectly." Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first come to marry, Eleanor would tell them the truth exactly as it happened, of a desperate proposal born from debt and fear, of secrets uncovered in darkened corridors, of a husband who had married her to protect a dangerous secret, and a wife who had, in the end, become not his destruction but his salvation. It was not the fairy tale beginning most young girls imagined for themselves, she would tell them, but it was, in every way that mattered, a far better story, one built not on easy fortune or simple romance, but on courage, honesty, and the slow, hard-won discovery that true partnership could grow even from the most unlikely and frightening of beginnings.